Thanks for joining us today for our Executive Outlook Spring 2026 briefing from our latest survey. We're excited to have you a part of this webinar today. And as you're hearing the presentation by Zach and Chris, feel free to put any specific questions you have or feedback for us in the chat, and we'll get to it at the end of the briefing. The briefing will be relatively short, but full of data points that senior executives from 50 plus employers have weighed in on this spring. Just to give a little context, we started this executive business outlook last fall and intend to do it twice a year as a real a place for these key data points to be shown, similar to the business roundtable that does these kind of metrics quarterly. We're doing these semi-annually. So to jump in, I want to go ahead and introduce the two folks who have been creating these surveys for us, Chris Brown and Zach Schofield of Centennial Economics, and they will lead the briefing today. And as I mentioned, feel free to put any questions in the chat. But Chris Brown, let me hand it over to you.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you, Debbie, and thank you to those for joining, today's conversation. Zach and I will walk through the results of the spring outlook, and at the end, we'll be more than happy to field questions. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat and or in the question submission field, and then we'll be able to discuss and address them towards the end. We'll have a little bit more opportunity for discussion at that point. So it's a great pleasure, and thank you, Debbie, for the vision and the real leadership in starting this survey. Been studying the Colorado economy for a long time. Been trying to understand the trends we're seeing in the data, trying to understand the interaction between the policy environment and specific legislation or the aggregate of policy and the impact on our state's economy. But we've been looking at this for some time, but this survey and this outlook presents a really unique perspective on those fundamental questions about our state's economic competitiveness. There's a lot of underlying data that we provide that provides context to the trends and to the sentiment that was drawn out from the survey responses. But thank you for, again, the vision and putting this together. And now, this is essentially in the second iteration, having conducted this in the fall and now gone through this in the spring. Joined by my partner at Centennial Economics, Zach Schofield, as well. If Zach, you want to say hello?
Hey, yeah, I wouldn't take any time. Just looking forward to the presentation, and yeah, I'll hand it back to you.
Fantastic. I think you're driving, so feel free to push us forward. So you can find the full results, and I'm sure Debbie and her team will follow up with the full report. It's available on the Cobert website. The survey asks questions of, as Debbie mentioned, over 50 executives across private sector, academia, and nonprofits about several key areas of both their sentiment towards the overall business climate, their expectation on investment in both capital, in workforce, their perspective on policy, both at the federal and state level. And we ask the same set of questions on a recurring basis, but then throw in a couple unique ones to add some context in the moment that we're in. At a high level, the three insights that really jumped out to us that we hope that readers and listeners here are able to come away with is, when asked the question about where do you see the business climate for Colorado and the U.S. going over the next 6 months, Colorado still trails the nation quite significantly. So 6 in 10 Colorado executives expect the state business climate to worsen. And again, that exceeds that is well below the outlook for the nation. There's some silver lining in that the outlook has improved slightly from the fall, but overall remains relatively lower than where the US is. Uh, Underlying that, however, employers remain confident to a degree about where their companies are heading. Half expect sales to increase, and most anticipate steady or increasing levels of investment in new capital and in workforce, despite both some of the aggregate macro headwinds and in spite of the concerns and sort of the growing headwinds, if you will, from a business climate perspective. And when asked about policy and the impact on policy, it's clear that that sentiment and the overall sort of souring sentiment on the business climate is driven in large part by the question around policy and how policy is impacting business and their ability to compete within the state and increasingly at the federal level as well. About half, or a little over half, now say federal policy, specifically highlighting trade policy, is it negatively impacting their business going forward. Along with the key survey questions, the several survey questions highlighting the sentiment of business executives, we also asked for three words. Describe your view on Colorado's current business climate. And then just on the right, you can see the words describing the views on the US business climate. And at the state level, in different iterations, interregulation and regulations came to the forefront. There's a level of uncertainty, but questions around a sort of more challenging regulatory and policy environment is creating sort of a sense of a higher cost of doing business, if you will, relative to where these organizations are in other states. At the federal level, a word that popped out was certainly uncertainty. And as a reminder, this survey was conducted in early to mid March, certainly at a time when there was elevated uncertainty. There was a Supreme Court ruling undoing some of the federal trade policy, rolling back some of the tariffs, creating another sense of uncertainty about what the long-term outcome might be, and the war in the Middle East really occurred or broke out right at the same time as this survey was in the field. So certainly a heightened sense of uncertainty at the federal level is reflected in these results. Go ahead, Zach. So first question, how do you expect the U.S. business climate to change in the next 6 months? In the fall, a little over a third expected the business climate to improve. That remained steady, declining somewhat to about right at 33% in the spring outlook. The share that expected the U.S. business climate to decline actually grew slightly from 35 to 44%, while the no change sort of declined. So a slight increase in the expectation around declining U.S. business climate, where if you look at the right table, when asked about Colorado's business climate and the change over the next 6 months, right around 8-10% expect the state's business climate to improve, whereas the share that expected decline sort of decreased slightly. Some silver lining, but again, the differential between in the spring outlook, 60% expect the business climate in the state to decline, whereas only 44% expect the U.S. to decline. That differential still looms over the state's overall climate. Go ahead, Zach. And again, this survey came out was in the field in early March. We were still awaiting some of the year-end and January employment data. Just as of last week, we've now had a couple weeks straight of being able to see the latest in the economic performance at the state level through February. And in February, saw another decline in overall employment. The state's unemployment rate is is hovering right around 3.9%, remaining below the US unemployment rate, which is in some ways a positive sign. However, the decline in employment and over the course of 2025, we now know that while the state added 20,800 jobs in growing sectors, there was about 31,000, a little more than 31,000 jobs lost in declining sectors. So the state actually had a net negative employment growth over the course of 2025. And for the first time since 2004, experienced a net decline in domestic migration or a negative net migration, more people leaving the state than coming into the state, again, for the first time in over 20 years. So these headwinds in the raw data, in the recent economic trends, is certainly reflected in that overall sentiment. Go ahead, Zach.
There we go. Okay. Great. Thank you, Chris. I'll be explaining some of the the key survey results to some of the questions that we asked. And a lot of these follow the same trends that Chris has already talked about. So if we look at sales and investment, we can see that there is a sense of growing optimism, both in Colorado and at the U.S. level. These numbers are heading in a positive direction, but the Colorado versus U.S. differential is still, much more in favor of the national level. And before I get too far into these numbers, I just want to iterate, like, we have two observation points. We have the fall and the spring. And so that's not quite enough to really determine a strong trend. There are some jumps that are significant enough that we think there's a story there, but some of these changes are slight enough that, that could just be variation in the survey responses. So speaking specifically, company sales, like Chris mentioned, more companies are optimistic about their potential for growth in sales. That's an increase from the fall to the spring. More businesses thought they would be able to grow their sales, and fewer businesses thought that their sales would decrease. So that's a positive sign, I think, for the business outlook for the next 6 months. Looking at capital investment, we think that increase in Colorado from 23% to 28% from the fall to the spring in that bottom left table, that's close enough that technically it's in the right direction. That may not, we would want to see the fall 2026 survey before we really talked about a trend, but those numbers are moving in the right direction at least. Shifting to the United States, though, we think a jump from 26% to a 42%, 42% of respondents saying that they are planning on increasing their U.S. capital investment, that is significant. That's a pretty big jump, not quite double, but maybe a 90-80% increase in that kind of response. So we think that's a positive sign for the economy at the national level. And you can see what's interesting is that shift comes from those that were on the fence, that said that there would be no change in their U.S. capital investment. Those that thought their capital investment would decrease stayed the same, but those that were unsure or thought that their level of investment would remain neutral or would not change, that declined. And so while that could be as businesses plan around trade policy or tariff policy, maybe they're planning on making those investments in the United States. Our survey doesn't ask that question specifically, but yeah, we're seeing this shift into a more positive investment environment for the United States.
And Zach, real quick, we can discuss this more towards the end. I just wanted to address this now. We got a question about the extent to which, both in, I think it's related to the context you've shared here, but certainly the overall employment figures that I shared in the prior slide. How confident are we in the accuracy in the employment and job numbers as they're being released? And I should have noted, but some of the 2025 numbers through December have already gone through a round of revisions to true up or revise based on further survey responses that came in. So we do know that through at least one revision, the overall employment figure for 2025 is negative. There will be certainly further revisions, and there will be revisions to the January and February estimates as months go on, but generally remain fairly confident. The overall U.S. employment teetered at just about 0.1%, just grew at just a tenth of a percent in 2025. And given the relative changes we've seen in the sectors in Colorado, do think that overall it seems everything is pointing in the direction that Colorado experienced relatively well, certainly negative employment growth, but more modest employment growth than the U.S. So at this point, those 2025 figures have already seen some revisions, gone through revisions to indicate and give us a little more confidence that they'll be the final numbers.
Yeah, Chris, that's a really great question. 2025, we saw some pretty drastic changes, drastic revisions to those employment numbers. But like Chris said, the data that we are looking at now has been revised before, and we think that the 2025 number, that picture is probably not going to significantly change. You might see some changes to the February numbers that came out most recently, but yeah, I think um, the Colorado level numbers in 2025 probably not going to move all that much. The picture at least is going to be the same, we think. Okay. Speaking of workforce, this table shows the respondents' outlook on their employment over the next 12 months in Colorado, and outside of Colorado. And I think the story to be told here is that there's really not a lot of change. So companies that are planning on expanding in Colorado stayed about the same. Same with those expanding outside of Colorado. I think the silver lining here in this workforce plan question has to do with those planning on reducing their workforce in Colorado. And so we see this shift from, about a fifth of respondents saying that they were planning on reducing their workforce in Colorado in the fall, to now closer to a tenth. So, about 12%. So that's, again, moving in the right direction. The actual sentiment, though, we are seeing this, there's a potential disconnect between that sentiment and the data that we're seeing. Keep in mind that the data that we're looking at is looking backwards, whereas this survey is looking forwards. So that might be, that might be, the reason why we, have that disconnect. But I think similar to the investment question, we have more businesses moving from this no change category to something a little bit more positive. So in the fall, we had, 28% of respondents saying that they weren't planning on changing their workforce inside or outside of Colorado. And at least now there are fewer planning on reducing, and they've kind of shifted over to this no change category. So overall, the picture is essentially flat, with maybe some silver lining, fewer companies planning on reducing their workforce. But I think the positive sign here, though, is that overwhelmingly 75% of the executives that were surveyed anticipate their workforce to either expand or at least be maintained. And so I think that's a positive outlook for Colorado in the coming 12 months. Great. And then we asked a question on federal policy broadly, but then also a question specifically on trade policy. So you'll see that the federal policy, we have that question shown by the table to the left. We have an observation for both fall and spring. We asked the same question in both surveys. And you have this really interesting shift from respondents saying that they were neutral in the fall to now being majority negative in the spring. We think that does correlate very strongly with the conflict in Iran, and potential issues around trade policy. Because this question that we asked for the first time in the spring, in the table to the right, asks specifically about federal trade policy. We see that that's viewed overwhelmingly negative. And so we're about a year now since, a little bit more than a year from when the White House started promulgating trade barriers and different trade agreements with various other nations. There's been a series of tariffs imposed and then halted, agreements made, and so there was certainly a lot of uncertainty about where the nation would land in terms of their trade policy. Now that we're a year later, we have a little bit more clarity. But as Chris mentioned, as we reached that clarity just before the survey was taken, we have a Supreme Court justice or a Supreme Court decision that undid a lot of the tariffs, declared many of them illegal, and now the government is setting up programs to repay businesses that paid these tariffs. So there's still a lot of uncertainty around federal trade policy. There's this give and take between the White House and the Supreme Court. And so that story's not over, and I think that's contributing to the survey results we're seeing here. But at least, so there's the uncertainty piece, uh, which I think is reflected in that word cloud we showed at the beginning. But then the federal trade policy in and of itself appears to be viewed negatively, uh, with that 58% response. Okay. And then touching on state policy in Colorado, it's interesting to see this evolve over from the fall to the spring. Uh, about a third viewed state policy as neutral in the fall, and that sentiment has declined now to about 17%, and those that were neutral now view the state policy more negatively. Um, and then kind of at the same, so additionally, we asked this new question around a progressive income tax. Um, and this is a ballot measure that's been proposed. We'll probably very likely see it on the ballot in November. And, uh, you know, more than 50% of those that took the survey responded that they viewed that progressive income tax very negatively as well. So we think there's a couple things at play here. There's the existing regulatory and regulatory structure within Colorado that's viewed negatively. That's that table to the left, 65% in the fall and 81% in the spring view that negatively. And now you have this new layered on potential shift in state tax policy that is also viewed negatively. So we think that from the perspective of business leaders, both on the tax side and the regulatory side, there's not a lot of optimism about the Colorado environment. With that said, though, the Colorado State Legislature has moved forward with SB 26 SB 137. And this is a bipartisan effort to address this perceived regulatory burden in the state. And so this would increase the opportunities for regulations to be reviewed and changes some of the sunset provisions for those regulations. And so that's certainly a step to address this the sentiment among business leaders that policy is, I don't think it's not sure that it will pass. It's still in the legislature. It's an ongoing story, certainly. But at least the state legislature is starting to make steps in addressing this perception. In addition to the survey responses, we also note that a couple other organizations, the Tax Foundation and the Colorado Chamber, have survey responses and studies that mirror and rhyme with these survey responses. And so the Tax Foundation finds Colorado in the bottom half of the 50 states in terms of tax competitiveness, and the Colorado Chamber found Colorado to be, one of the sixth most regulated states in the nation. So there's certainly an uphill battle as far as the business environment goes at the state level. Okay, great. I'll pass it back to you, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. As we look at as we pondered and talked a lot about the survey results, really kind of what jumped out to us is there's a lot of underlying strengths, a lot of underlying uh, uh, sort of core pieces and tenets of the Colorado economy, strong sectoral strength in emerging tech and aerospace, very strong workforce from an education standpoint, even though again saw a decline in the overall size of the labor force last year. We still, in part because of a declining participation rate, still have the sixth highest labor force participation rate. Been able to attract entrepreneurs, venture funding, and still see strong sectoral growth. At the same time, a lot of headwinds around both in the immediate term around the ability to attract and retain talent, to see a decline in the net migration, employment declining, and seeing now a couple consecutive months of negative employment growth. Again, highlighted as the sixth most regulated state and rising costs of living and energy. And so the survey and the continued perspective from the business leaders participating in these surveys, I think gives a good insight into where they see both of the combination of these strengths and challenges netting out and impacting the business climate over the next 6 months. Go ahead, Zach. And again, we'd
Great.
be happy to field and take questions on any of the specifics in the survey, any of the specific questions and responses. But just want to leave you with that the state's business climate did see very modest improvements from the fall survey, with stronger expectations for sales, investment, and some stability in the workforce. But the overall climate still lags the nation, despite even some growing uncertainty at the national level. Regulatory and the policy environment remain that top concern for the competitiveness of Colorado. And um, even among growing sort of geopolitical and federal uncertainty that softened the national sentiment, employers do remain resilient and continue to uh, expect while expect growth here in the state, which is again both overall a positive sign that as the in some ways the economy sort of teeters on the edge, expect Colorado employers expect to be able to, from their vantage points now, continue to navigate and manage growth going forward. So, Debbie, turn it back over to you if there's any final thoughts or questions. But thank you again, and look forward to the continued dialogue.
Great. Thank you, Chris and Zach. And maybe Zach, put it back to the conclusions panel just as we wrap up today. Wanted to let our Covert partners know we do have printed copies of the report. You will be able to click on the link and print it out yourself. It's a PDF. If you'd prefer some printed copies sent to you, we have some limited amount of printed copies. Happy to do that. Just kind of going to the why we pull together information like this again before we break. One of the reasons we work on policy issues here in Colorado is we believe fundamentally that business is a force for good. Businesses create jobs, provide pathways, pay taxes, do a lot more than just create products and services. So to work together with our coalition to help the policy environment become more business friendly is an important part of our mission. And so to understand where business leaders are feeling those challenges and those opportunities is part of knowing how we can help advocate on their behalf. As Chris mentioned, there's some great stuff going on when you read the context portion of the report around what's going on to perhaps add some fixes to the regulatory framework here in Colorado, to streamline workforce systems. There's a lot of these initiatives that we're all working on together. And you'll be able to read some more of the context in the actual report. So while we have challenges as a state, we also want to look forward to what can we do together to make our state better, to collaborate with policy leaders in particular, and kind of move the ball forward. So with that, I think Chris and Zach, any other feedback or closing remarks before we wrap up? I don't see any other questions, but of course, the folks on the call know how to reach me, and I'm happy to answer questions after the webinar as well. But Chris and Zach, any closing remarks?
None for me. Thank you for the
No, thank you
opportunity.
and your team. Yeah, thank you.
All right. All right. Most economists just, that's pretty short and sweet. So appreciate the partnership. Many of you have known Chris for many years in partnership with our organization. Zach is new to the team and appreciate their help in putting these reports together. And thanks again. This has been a Zoom briefing of Colorado Business Roundtable. Thanks for joining.